a lot of different people draft 2 and 3 defenses, and I don't understand why. Your roster, all these players who are on your bench, ultimately are commodities. Hi, I'm Nick, your fantasy football expert, and every year I bet you come across a roster that looks like this. Well, I'm going to show you how to create a championship roster of your own so that you can win your own leagues. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is the draft because it all starts at the draft and how you structure your team. So, when I'm drafting, here's what I do. You want to draft running backs within those first 2 or 3 rounds. And you always want to pick running backs who have the opportunity for more touches. It doesn't matter if they're on the Jaguars or on a horrible team. What matters is the amount of opportunity that they get. You want to avoid those running backs who are in what's called a timeshare. So that means that they are part of a running back duo or sometimes even a trio. You want to avoid that because obviously your running back is going to get 10 carries as opposed to if he is the lone running back who gets 20 to 25 carries, which is optimal. So within those first few rounds, you want to look for running backs. Within the later rounds, as you can see here, what you want to do is you want to pick players who have high upside. So this could be players who are coming out of college, who are maybe not known nationally, but who were drafted high into the NFL. For example, a Justin Jefferson, who wasn't probably drafted in one of the first few rounds, but next year, because of his rookie season, he will probably be drafted within rounds 2 or 3. So you want to pick players with high upside. And you also want to pick those players because then if there are any injuries to your top players, they have the opportunity to move up into your lineup. Another good idea is to pick up players who are injured when the season starts. They are obviously going to be a little bit lower in most drafts. If you have the roster, which has a lot of starters, you can deal with the fact that those players may not play until later in the season. And those players, if you're lucky, will be able to come in during the bye weeks, at least for your top players, to be able to replace their points and their talent. And then when you're finishing off the draft, you want to, if you have the opportunity, you can throw in a few roster gambles, a few things. If they work out, it's great. If they don't work out, you can drop them after week 1. One tip that I like to use quite a bit, and I'm not sure if a lot of people use this, is check the injury report, injury status of players that you think about drafting. If a player has been injured in the previous year, more than likely they're not going to run into the same injury 2 years in a row. You want to avoid players who have a injury track record or players, sad to say, who have been free from injuries throughout their career, because at some point it's the NFL and players get injured. So if you have a player who did not play the year before, like for example this year, Keenan Allen, as you can see in my roster, he did not play last year that much. But because he didn't play last year, I was able to draft him in the 5th round instead of probably like the 2nd or 3rd round, and I got more value out of that player. So always check the injury reports. Also, another thing to keep an eye on is if a player had a monster season year before. A good example would be Patrick Mahomes, not in 2020, but in 2018, 2019, really 2018, he had a monster year. I think he had about 50 touchdowns. In 2019, there was a regression. For next year, I would think that Derrick Henry, with the amount of carries that he had, probably Dalvin Cook with the amount of carries to a lesser extent than maybe a Derrick Henry will have some regression and possibly injuries. So those are things to keep an eye on, especially if you're drafting high. One player that I would take a gamble on, Saquon Barkley. His career has not gone so far through the first few years as most people, especially in fantasy, had hoped for. And with his injuries last year, I'm expecting a huge bounce back year from him. It's kind of a make or break year for him. Your roster's created. You have your running backs, you have your quarterbacks. By the way, when you're drafting quarterbacks, look for players who have a good floor. You don't need players who have necessarily a tremendous upside, but as you can see, you want to have players who have the ability possibly to scramble, get a few yards running, but players who are on good offenses. And that's another thing a lot of people don't think about when they're drafting. Who are the coaches that this player is under? What sort of system, what sort of organization is this player under? It's especially important for quarterbacks, less important for running backs. James Robinson, for example, this year did not have a great system around him, but he had a monster year. Okay, so you've drafted, and the next big thing is week one, because week one is your way of assessing not only who you drafted, but who is on the waiver wire still and who is available. And it's a way of assessing your roster as you kind of feel out for the rest of the season. And really, another thing I wanted to point out in this video, and this is very important, one of the biggest keys to having a successful championship team is the week 2 waiver wire. There are players who weren't drafted. For example, this year, Ryan Tannehill would be a good example of that. In a lot of leagues, he was not drafted. And so he was on the waiver wire. Always check your waiver wire each week, but especially after that week 1, the players that you choose to pick up, because many players are overlooked and not drafted, you can get starter level players beginning for week 2. Okay, so let's go over some other roster rules and some roster no-nos. So when I am creating a team, I only go with one defense and I will stream throughout the season. I see a lot of different people who have 2 or 3 defenses on their team. And I don't really understand why. Because if your defense is not the one that's playing that week, what is their value? And that's how you have to look at all the players on your roster. You have to assess what is their value. Is this player tradable? Is this defense tradable? And when we talk about defenses, there's never going to be a defense that's tradable. For example, a few years ago, the New England Patriots had an amazing defense through like the first 9 weeks of their season. And I had that defense. But just like I just talked about, that defense was not tradable. And believe me, I tried. So that is a roster no-no. Make sure that you're only keeping one defense on your roster. I would also say the same thing for kickers. So if you have a kicker and you want to keep 2 or 3 kickers on your team, there's really no purpose in doing so. But kickers are important. And it's important to look at, especially toward the beginning of the season, the offenses that kickers are a part of. If you can see that that offense is going to be scoring a lot of touchdowns, then there's more opportunity for those kickers. But what's even more interesting is finding those offenses where they struggle in the red zone, which makes your kicker even more valuable. So those kind of in-between teams where they may not have a established running game, and you can use that to your advantage with kickers. So keep in mind, kickers are valuable and their points are valuable, especially when it comes to the playoffs. So this is my take on how to build a championship roster. Please feel free to comment below, click like, and let me know what you think. If you are interested and you like this video, I'm thinking about creating some more videos in the future. Until then, this is Nick, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.